Chapter 1, The Mask of Normal. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you think you can spot the monster before the truth comes out. Because tonight, the most terrifying crimes don't begin with screams. They begin with silence. On the surface, Chris Watts looked like the kind of man America trusted, without question. Clean-cut, soft-spoken, the type who nodded politely, avoided confrontation, and blended seamlessly into suburban life. In Frederick, Colorado, his neighbors saw him as a devoted husband and a hands-on father. He lived in a large, newly built home with his pregnant wife, Shannon Watts, and their 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste. Photos online painted a picture of family barbecues, birthday parties, matching T-shirts, and carefully curated happiness. Nothing about Chris Watts suggested danger. And that was precisely the problem. Those who knew him described him as emotionally flat, but reliable. He wasn't a loud guy at work, or the dominant personality in the room. He followed rules. He showed up on time. He kept his head down. In psychological terms, Chris Watts has spent most of his life perfecting invisibility. He avoided conflict at all costs, even when it came at the expense of his own identity. He learned early that silence was safer than honesty, that compliance earned approval, and that expressing anger only led to discomfort. Over time, this emotional suppression didn't disappear. It fermented. Inside the Watts household, Shannon was the visible force. Outspoken, energetic, and driven, she documented much of their lives on social media. To outsiders, it looked like confidence and control. To Chris, it felt like erasure. He didn't argue. He didn't rebel. He didn't explode. Instead, he retreated inward, storing resentment without language, without release. Psychologists later described this as identity fragmentation, a state where a person's internal self becomes disconnected from the role they perform daily. Chris Watts wasn't living as himself. He was playing a part. By 2018, the cracks were forming beneath the surface. Financial stress weighed heavily on the family. Their seemingly comfortable lifestyle masked mounting debt and a looming sense of failure. Shannon was pregnant with their 3rd child, a development that should have symbolized growth and stability. For Chris, it represented entrapment, another responsibility, another door closing. Still, he said nothing. Silence had become his coping mechanism, even as it slowly poisoned him. Then came the affair. When Chris met a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger, something shifted. With her, he wasn't the quiet husband or the compliant father. He was desired, seen, reinvented. He began to experience what psychologists call fantasy identity, a version of himself unburdened by responsibility, guilt, or past choices. In this new narrative, he was free, single, unattached, and most dangerously, entitled to happiness at any cost. This fantasy didn't coexist peacefully with reality. It collided with it. Chris Watts began mentally dividing his life into 2 incompatible worlds. On one side, his wife, his children, his responsibilities, and the shame he associated with them. On the other, freedom, passion, and a future rewritten from scratch. This internal split created intense cognitive dissonance. He still believed himself to be a good person, a decent man. But good people don't abandon their families. They don't lie effortlessly. They don't harbor thoughts they refuse to name. To resolve this contradiction, Chris didn't change his behavior. He changed his perception. In his mind, his family gradually transformed from people into problems. This psychological process is chillingly common among family annihilators. Rather than seeing loved ones as individuals with rights and emotions, the offender reframes them as obstacles standing in the way of personal fulfillment. Responsibility becomes oppression. Children become baggage. Marriage becomes a prison. And once that mental shift occurs, moral boundaries begin to dissolve. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Chris's detachment became noticeable, though not immediately alarming. He grew distant, less affectionate, emotionally unavailable. Shannon sensed something was wrong and confronted him, but he continued to avoid honest conflict. Even when cornered, he minimized, deflected, and retreated. Direct confrontation would have required emotional courage. Ending the marriage would have required accountability. Facing financial collapse would have required humility. Chris Watts had none of those tools. Instead, he did what he had always done. He withdrew into himself. By August 2018, Sean had traveled out of state for a business trip. During that time, Chris lived fully inside his fantasy. He spent time with his affair partner. He imagined a future where the past simply disappeared. Not resolved, not repaired, erased. Investigators later determined that this period was critical. It wasn't just an affair anymore. It was rehearsal, a test run of a life without consequences. When Sean returned home in the early hours of August 13th, nothing outwardly appeared unusual. There were no reports of a violent argument heard by neighbors, no frantic phone calls, no visible signs of a breaking point. And yet, within hours, Sean and her daughters were gone. What followed would shock the nation. That morning, Chris spoke to police with unsettling calm. He pleaded for his family's safe return on local television, his voice steady, his eyes dry. He stood on his neighbor's porch and watched surveillance footage with an eerie lack of urgency. To train investigators, something was off. His words expressed concern. His body did not. There was no panic, no desperation. Just a man performing the role of a worried husband, the same way he had performed every role before. As the investigation unfolded, experts began to see the psychological blueprint clearly. This was not a crime of sudden rage. It was a crime of avoidance taken to its most extreme conclusion. Chris didn't lash out because he was overwhelmed by emotion. He killed because he was incapable of facing it. Behind the calm demeanor was a man who had spent his entire life running from discomfort. And now, with his fantasy self on the line, he chose the most irreversible escape imaginable. By the time the truth began to surface, the mask of normal had already done its damage. And the question investigators were left with wasn't just how this happened, but how someone so invisible had managed to hide such darkness in plain sight. The answers wouldn't come easily, and they wouldn't come all at once.